Hello, welcome to MJRRPG, a podcast for tabletop role-playing games reviews, replays, etc. and so forth. The following is a review of the Call of Cthulhu scenario Unland, though I ran this in Kult Divinity Lost, written by Scott Dorward for Stygian Fox's Fear Sharp Little Needles. As always, the first part of this review is spoiler light for players and keepers, while the latter half is full of spoilers. I'll warn you off before we get to the spoiler section. In short, Unland is a compact but versatile scenario with an excellent atmospheric setting that can be elevated to a true nightmarish classic depending on the player characters. The Fear's Sharp Little Needles scenarios are all extremely short, lacking pre-gen investigators, and largely of a sort of sandbox or role-playing seed structure, giving the keeper the pieces and prompts to make the scenario their own. Unland largely follows this mold by laying out the location, interactions, a handful of NPCs, and potential endpoints, but with no point-by-point progression, and crucially no pre-generated investigators. There will be much more on that point later in both spoiler light and spoiler sections. The scenario takes place in an abandoned fairground. Can't really say any more than that without spoilers, but you can rest assured that Scott Dorward has prepared some pleasantly unsettling scenes and ideas for your group to suffer through. Despite the page limit only taking up about 4 pages of text, with one being stats, plus a full page map and another cover illustration, the park receives just enough description to make it wonderfully creepy. With pictures of nature-acclaimed theme parks littering the internet, most keepers should find it easy enough to flesh out some of the more bare-bones descriptions. There isn't much more that can be said about Unland without really delving into spoilers, but it should be noted that the scenario can only truly shine when the players give substantial role-playing effort. If treated as a simpler mystery scenario to poke around an environment, avoid some dangers, and find the source of weirdness to deal with, in the vein of many classic Call of Cthulhu scenarios, Unland will still be an enjoyable little romp through a creepy amusement park, but the real meat on the horror bone will be left untouched. One note is I both played and ran the scenario in Kult Divinity Lost, rather than Call of Cthulhu. I first joined a session ran by Sue Savage, and it fit the Kult system perfectly and made me immediately want to run it for my home group. Unland is undoubtedly changed by using Kult, though, in a way not every group may enjoy. With Kult, the focus is placed much more on the characters rather than the environment. Sort of the opposite of a skill-based system like Call of Cthulhu, where nearly every role is a way for the players to interact with the world. While in Kult, almost every role in some way is turned back in on the characters. Given Unland's themes, this actually fits like a glove, but it undoubtedly makes for a slower, though I would say spookier, pace. The pre-gens made by Sue are absolutely fantastic, to the point I think of them as semi-official. No matter if running the scenario in Call of Cthulhu or Kult, or whatever system, I highly suggest a keeper at least look at the pre-gens for inspiration, if not use them by default. Link in more details in the spoiler section. The very tight page length does come with a couple drawbacks, most notably the lack of pre-gens or example character backgrounds, but also no background on a key NPC, and the attraction and general park descriptions could easily be doubled while still feeling a bit anemic in places. I would also never complain about simple character portraits, and the small handful of NPCs could have benefited from them. No matter the system though, I can't recommend Unland enough. I'm a big fan of low page count scenarios, and Unland is a perfect example of how much quality can be crammed into a small package, and also how heady themes and deeper personal horror can be brought about in a organic way, without pages upon pages of NPC backstories or monologues. It requires some work on the part of the keeper, and certainly on the players as well, but in the best of ways. Fear's Sharp Little Needles can be bought on DriveThruRPG in PDF or print on demand. The following very long section, is full of spoilers. If you're wanting to play this at some point, I would say stop right here. Let's keep on going. Unland is a single location / escape scenario, but notably with no sort of ticking clock, and with no direct threat to the characters unless they bring something down upon themselves. In fact, no one can die in Unland, as all physical wounds regenerate quickly over time. As a largely sandbox scenario, it's not really possible to give a point-by-point walkthrough of the game. It's also very versatile. For example, the below actual plays are considerably different, and my own runs of this scenario were nothing like either of them. First one is Ain't Slayed Nobody, featuring both Scott Dorward as keeper and some of the How We Roll crew as players, and the other is by the Apocalypse players, who managed to make a 4-page scenario run for about 8 hours, and feature some very different player characters. See links in the show notes. The player characters find their way to the abandoned Funland, and from there wander about the fog-choked park, soon discovering they can no longer locate the gate. How the party comes to the park is entirely up to the keeper, though a few suggestions are given. There are 3 ways to escape the park, along with a couple ways to become stuck forever. And there's also a viable option for the player to decide their character willingly stays in the park indefinitely. Unland's premise and main puzzle is that the park is a pocket dimension of the Phantom of Truth, with those that enter unable to escape until they leave behind a remnant, a bit of themselves made up of some lie, or conversely a deep, uncomfortable truth they won't admit. On a little aside, I'm currently playing through Persona 4 for the first time right now, and this is kind of like a really weird, twisted inversion of that. Has nothing to do with anything, just thought I'd mention that. The park, or temple as it's now thought of, is cared for by the park's old PR manager, Ina Matthews, who is now an insane priestess of the Phantom of Truth and fully believes she is helping people. Escaping the park requires either leaving a remnant, and therefore leaving part of their very being behind, destroying an icon of the Phantom of Truth that binds the park to the pocket dimension, or somehow convincing Ina to lead them out. Of the 3 ways out, leaving behind the remnant is by far the most interesting, and given that it takes up the most text, I'd imagine it is the intended method. I can't help but feel the destroy the idol method, or the associated convincing, aka threatening, Ina to let them out method, sidestep the scenario's most interesting theme in horrific scenes. Destroying the idol is not easy by any means, requiring either a few turns and a hard mechanical repair roll, or doing significant damage, all the while making continuous power rolls to avoid increasingly difficult sand rolls. Most investigators would succumb to madness well before succeeding with brute force, and I doubt many investigators will come with mechanical repair unless the keeper wills it. This is entirely dependent on the group and keeper, of course, but I personally don't much like there being a violent solution to this scenario, or one that requires such a barrage of dice rolls. Threatening Ina Matthews with destruction of the idol is also a really simple way to get her to lead the party out of the park, once again bypassing more interesting decisions and dilemmas. So here are 2 pretty big changes I would make to both the idol and Ina. Firstly, destroying the idol does not simply release Funland from the pocket dimension, but also immediately releases every remnant left behind by other victims. Ina would desperately explain this to the party as they try and destroy the idol, and if she wasn't present, every nearby mirror would begin cracking, the remnants pounding harder and harder on the mirrors and beginning to worm their way out. Really anything to make it clear what will happen if the investigators continue destroying the idol. And indeed, they might still destroy it, deciding that destroying Unland is necessary to stop any more future victims, despite knowing that every remnant will be released, and who will no doubt immediately swarm the investigators, driving them completely insane with the deluge of dozens, if not hundreds, of people's most horrible acts and lies. The second change would be Ina cannot lead the investigators out of the park, as she herself is trapped until she leaves behind a remnant. Her past could be made up whole scratch, but the easiest way would be to tie it to the park's dark background. It was closed due to a park employee committing serial murder, and perhaps Ina had known about the murders but had done nothing to stop or reveal them, wanting to protect the park's reputation instead. Or maybe even worse, she was involved in the murders directly, but had the other employee take the fall. Ina now sees serving the Phantom of Truth as her penance for what she'd done, and doesn't believe she can just leave it all behind like Unland's other victims. Convincing her to reveal her past and leave a remnant would require some tough interpersonal roles, and probably psychology or something similar to realize she's lying about not being trapped. And even if convinced, once Ina creates a remnant from her lies, only she can leave the park, leaving the characters behind until they leave behind their own lies. And that still doesn't end Unland, though without Ina around, maybe fewer victims will be lured in. The scenario is also extremely dependent on the player characters' backgrounds. They absolutely must have some dark secret, otherwise the crux of the game, creating a remnant and losing a piece of yourself, has no impact. Again, Unland would work fine as a traditional explore a spooky place type scenario, but what will make it memorable is its themes of lying, truth, and if forgetting or losing those parts of ourselves is a good or terrible thing. I think Unland is best served by the keeper preparing characters for the players beforehand with tailor-made dark secrets, involving one another. If the players are making their own characters, the keeper should work with them to create backgrounds, keeping them secret from one another to amplify the impact once revealed. Bringing in existing characters would be pretty difficult. Unless they already had secret backgrounds or had done things during the course of a campaign they were ashamed of, it would be hard to make creating a remnant be as life-changing as it is for a purpose-made character. There are also a few good chances for characters to become eternally lost in Unland. A horrific but poignant end for a pre-gen character, but it may be a disappointing end for a long-term character. As mentioned earlier, I both played and run Unland using Kult Divinity Lost, both times using characters and advice from Sue Savage. At this point, I find it hard to think of Unland as anything but a cult scenario, and the 4 characters Sue created feel intricately tied to the story. Sue has generously shared the character sheets, and even if not running the scenario in Cult, I'd highly suggest still using the character backgrounds when preparing your own characters, or at least looking at them for inspiration. The characters' dark secrets are all directly impacting one another, and both times I played around this, the revealing scene has been both intensely uncomfortable in the best of ways. See the show notes for links to Sue's characters. If using Cult, not much has to be changed. There will be less roles in general, but those that are made will inevitably have a greater impact on the characters. The main change that needs to be made would be to the Phantom of Truth, and once again, this is all from Sue Savage. The mythosy Phantom of Truth can be replaced by a Servant of Malkuth, an angel for the Ishim choir, I would think. Sue suggested Fanul, the Angel of Truth, which isn't mentioned anywhere in the Cult rulebook, but Google and Wikipedia will get you there. Nothing more necessarily needs to be changed, but I like to reskin the idol a bit. In this case, the mannequins are still there, but tied to a spiderweb of wires. A See Through the Veil role reveals a great figure in the center of the room, far taller and wider than any human. Porcelain white skin and great feathered wings, arms and legs splayed open, with hundreds if not thousands of wires dug through its skin and wrapped around its bones. These wires are the latticework of struts/marionette strings that surround Unland. It stares with large black eyes that hold deep sadness, and its mouth is sewn shut. Destroying the idol then means not physically smashing the mannequins, but instead ripping the wires out of the angel, a far more gruesome task. It does not resist, but the process would require repeated keep it together rolls, as the characters feel the angel's compassion and sadness, and realize that the angel will both perish and still release the remnants. The short length of Unland is mostly a strength, but it does mean it suffers from a lack of descriptions, with many attractions only getting a sentence or 2 at most, and other locations nothing at all. Again, an abandoned theme park is easy to imagine, so most keepers can make up sensory narration on their own, but it's still a little bit of extra work. The larger issue, though, is with one NPC not having any background at all. With only 3 NPCs present, it's a bit disappointing to not know why the young woman who hanged herself is in the park, and what her dark secret is. I would have also liked a table of lies that remnants may hold in them, in case they are freed and infect a player character. Besides these small nitpicks, Unland is one of my favorite short scenarios, as evidenced by this review being about 3/4 the length of the scenario itself. Treat yourself and your table, whether in Call of Cthulhu or Cult. As long as you're willing to put in some extra work and your players are ready for a likely uncomfortable time, you will not be disappointed. Again, Unland can be found in Fear's Sharp Little Needles, available on DriveThruRPG as a PDF or print on demand. It's a good-sized book to have on the shelf, but the PDF is nice and navigable if you can't shell out for today's crazy shipping costs. Thank you for listening. As always, thank you to Cryochamber for use of their album Cthulhu. Links in the show notes. Also, thank you to Sue Savage for running the game for me a while ago, and for putting the character sheets up. Links to the character sheets and Sue's blog, once again, in the show notes. Until next time, have a good one.